Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody here and on Zoom. This is a really wonderful opportunity for us to have this program today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maureen McCarthy. I stepped into amazingly gigantic shoes from Ty to take over as the program director for the National Security Forum. Today is our opportunity to celebrate our founder and somebody who had a profound impact on all of our lives and many, many people from all over the world. We're going to start with Professor Barbara Walker giving a talk from her perspective, having known Ty for many years and been professional colleagues. So this is an opportunity for you to hear not only from each other, but also from a professional colleague about the things that they thought about and talked about for many years. And of course, we are fabulously honored to have Sue Ellen and Bill with us today to join us, to have the family here. This is a fitting tribute. This is the video interview that we did with Ty at least 6 years ago up at Arrow Creek. It's Ty reflecting on some of the important topics that he thought we should be covering and that people should be discussing. And interestingly enough, they're all still relevant. It's a wonderful way to just hear in his mind why the National Security Forum was so important to him and to the community. And he talks about it starting with 12 friends coming to breakfast at the Gold and Silver and evolving into the organization that we have now.
Brent, when I returned to Reno, I was somewhat surprised not to see an organization here that most communities of the size of Reno had, either a World Affairs Council or a Council on Foreign Relations affiliate. And I found that there was two things: widespread interest in having such an organization, and two, an amazing group of individuals who lived in this area with extensive experience in the national security arena. So the two melded, and we began meeting informally, and that later led to the creation of a nonprofit called the National Security Forum of Northern Nevada, and it's been operating very well for 17 years.
That is remarkable, and this is largely possible because of your background, which we have covered in another video. But you had military experience, you had experience in the White House, you worked in the nonprofit world teaching conservation. You probably had a unique view on the need to understand world affairs. To those of us who may not get that importance, why should we care?
The events around the world can be very confusing. There are wars going on in Syria, in the Asian area, in Africa. There are problems of global poverty and today more sophisticated concerns such as the ability of hostile entities like in Russia with enormous cyber capabilities as well as other advanced scientific methodology. We need to have an understanding of the threats that are posed by various entities and what the United States and its allies can do to ameliorate those challenges.
Give us an idea of what a National Security Forum meeting is like.
Let's take one example. We had Ray Hufstedler, who was a former executive director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, speak on numerous occasions. What are the implications from both the military involvement, the deployment, and the political arena? Well, we had Assistant Secretary of State Mark Kimmett, Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, come here to Reno to speak. So that's a general idea of the high quality speakers that we have available.
Drop a few more names. Give us a few more ideas of topics that you've covered.
Cyber is obviously an important one, and so we're fortunately to have Tony Rucci, who has an organization called Insider Threats and frequently is in this area, and we've had Tony as well as folks at the university looking at the cyber challenge. We also understand that the global environment is shaped to a great extent by economic forces and trends. And we're fortunate to have people like Jerry O'Driscoll, who formerly worked with the Federal Reserve here, as well as professors from the University of Nevada, Reno, assisting us on that. A very interesting area. What about the possibility of bio attacks, utilizing virulent diseases we've seen in the past with, say, smallpox or with the swine flu. And so we've had panels dealing with bioterrorism. It's a growing and concerning threat.
It's remarkable how many of these experts are really local people, and it's also remarkable how many you've been able to pull in from Washington.
Well, we are fortunate in one respect in the northern Nevada, northern California area, like Lake Tahoe especially. It's been an attractive place for former high-ranking military and importantly civilian and intelligence community officials to retire. For example, Keith Hansen lives at Tahoe, and he was a former national intelligence officer looking at issues relating to strategic programs and proliferation. So we do have a coterie of great expertise in this area we're able to tap, but sometimes we don't, and I still have connections in the diplomatic and military area, and I'll call my friends in Washington and say, you're on your way to Japan, or you're going to go to California to speak to this group, stop in Reno, and because you owe it to us. And we've had great success in being able to convince high-ranking officials to come here.
This has been a remarkable growth. You started very small.
With 12 people meeting at the Gold and Silver for breakfast to, as I said in our recent meetings at the Sands, we have over 250 to 300 people now attending.
And what do you see as the need that this serves in this community? What role will it play as it moves forward?
As this moves forward, we will be the premier organization that provides informed commentary and creates programs relating to critical national security issues, be that military and defense, be that medical areas, global economics. This will be the organization that brings speakers with recognized expertise to address our group regarding these most critical national security concerns.
Dr. Tyers Cobb, the founder of National Security Forum, thank you very much for being with us. If you haven't caught one of the meetings, you should check us out online and see a little bit about what we have to offer and come be part of the conversation.
Some of you may have heard and met Barbara a few months ago when she gave a little perspective into Putin's Russia. I asked Barbara to do this presentation today, not just because of the subject matter, but because she was a friend of Ty's. And she said, can I make it a tribute to Ty? Yes, of course. Let me introduce to you Professor Barbara Walker, who is professor of Russian and Soviet history at UNR and a fabulous, wonderful resource for us in the area.
Thank you, Maureen. It's an incredible pleasure and joy just to be with you guys, to be able to engage with you once again. I've been sort of engaged with this group off and on for a long, long time now. Always been a total pleasure and an inspiring kind of civic experience in so many different ways. Honoring Ty Cobb is the title of my talk today, by thinking about U.S. national security today. And it's really about a lot of conversations that I had with Ty between about 2010 or 11 or so and about 2013. And things that we were worrying about in a really quiet way about the relationship maybe between academia and national security in this country. But it was an incredibly enriching experience. And really only at 2:30 a.m. this morning did I realize how much, as I was kind of completely rewriting this talk, of all people, Thai, in the most profound sense, was loyal to democracy. And I sort of want to start with that. And that's kind of a theme throughout my talk about all the different ways in which he was just utterly committed to community, a civil society, people committed to talking to each other, listening to each other, and moving forward together as a community that is also a secure, safe community in a world that it's really easy to kind of forget about when you're lost sort of in the midst of being in the US, which is a huge country, but nevertheless a major actor in the world more broadly. So we connected originally because I was curious about his trip that he took to do his PhD research to the Soviet Union, I think in the late 1970s, about the right time that this was. We started talking about his research experience, which involved the KGB, but in a really fascinating classic Thai kind of way. But we ended up talking about a whole lot of other things as well. And these were kind of open-ended conversations where I was just very confused in a lot of ways as a Russianist about contemporary approach to Russian history and more generally to changes in academia since the end of the Cold War that I thought made us less safe. So we talked about his PhD and how he got it at Georgetown. Fascinatingly, and this is actually not untypical for people who do Russian or Soviet history, it wasn't just history. It was often called Soviet studies or Russian studies, and that involved literature, culture, society. So a really broad sort of understanding of this very different, in some ways different, in some ways similar culture to our own. We talked about his adventures in Vietnam, which I'm sure other people can talk about more vividly than I. We talked about how he grew up in Nevada, the incredible importance of family to both of us, and sort of the experiences of growing up. I'm half German, so I grew up partly in Germany. My father was in the military. He met my mother back in the mid-50s, and she came to the US. They married. So she was actually kind of a war bride, but a little bit late. But anyway, so my family was kind of deeply enmeshed in US military history as well. So we talked through all these different sorts of things about our past and the meaning of those pasts and how they connect with American history as well. We also talked a lot about war and its extreme impact on the human experience and the difficulties of peace and finding it. Something that really bothered me at the time was just the weakness of academic military history after the end of the Cold War. I'll talk more about that later, but it was kind of like, okay, we won. War is done, let's move on. And this is something that I have continued to worry about ever since. What was so incredible about these conversations was Ty's openness, listening to somebody who was very confused and inexperienced in certain ways, his incredible kindness, his acceptance of the ways that I was worried and thinking. And this is just something that I want to emulate in every aspect of my life, his sort of recognition of every single individual human being just as human and full of dignity for that reason. I just want to quote his daughter, Jacqueline Fuller, from the RGJ Memorial to Ty. He enjoyed hearing about what people thought, and he wouldn't challenge or belittle them with how much he knew. And that was just so much my experience with him. And I feel that I learned from his his respect for people, and his care as much as anything else in those conversations. So to get back to the theme of democracy, I think he understood in this like the most profound sense that democracy is a process. It's not a condition. It's not something you get to and aha, we got it. There it is. We made it. It is a matter of constantly reaching out, of talking to all different kinds of people who are members of your community, whether you're intimately involved with them or not. He lived this out in his life in the most profound way as well. I just listed a few of the organizations in which he was deeply involved: the Business Executives for National Security, this amazing National Security Forum here, the Northern Nevada International Center with Karina Black and her global outreach through the Northern Southern Nevada International Center, to legal, to business, to people just from all around the world, bringing them to Nevada and sending others out to other countries as well. And I'm sure that all of you know of many more sort of organizations, outreach organizations that he became involved with. But above all, the qualities that shone in all of these activities was that he was always listening. He was responding across all kinds of boundaries, professional, cultural, familial, and so on. And he met people where they were. He understood that you have to kind of accept and recognize that people are where they are and sort of try to work from there in terms of developing sort of communication with them. He was not, in my experience, in any way ideological because of his incredible humaneness. He also understood that people, just like democracy, are constantly in a state of change, that we are always sort of, and I don't want to use the word evolving because it sounds so sort of technical somehow, but we're not rigid, stable, perfectly set people. Every step of experience that we have changes us a little bit in some way. We talked a lot about his various forms of professional engagement. By the way, I just totally love this photograph. His PhD, which we talked about a lot and which was deeply prescient in terms of just global affairs, was on oil, Russian oil. So the issue of energy as an absolute foundation for the development of the world and global relations in so many ways. Also the potential for Russia to become a petrostate. It was a vital topic at that time, and it continues to be today, showing the, just his deep sort of connection and sensitivity to what really is important in global affairs. We talked about his teaching at West Point, which I think he really enjoyed, engaging with people who also cared about national security, and teaching them his humane approach. From there, he went to Reagan's National Security Council, I think partly because of his incredible communicative skills. He talked a lot, actually, about the early NSC and how when he got there, there was almost nobody there other than him and a few other people. He said under Carter, the NSC had just been packed to the gills, and that when Reagan came in, there was just a lot less GOP expertise to draw on, and yet there were ways in which he actually found that to be good because there wasn't quite such a cacophony as there had been under Carter. But he did mention that he was the only guy on European affairs for a while. He also talked about how he thought possibly the Iran-Contra scandal might have been a result of that sort of thinness on the ground of expertise there. We talked a lot about his trips to the Ramstein Air Base and his visits there, how he engaged with people there. It was clear that he was deeply involved in just the very core of European, American, and global security in so many different ways. His diplomatic skills took him also to the Reagan-Gorbachev summits, which I think is one of the things for which he is probably best known. It certainly made a deep impression on him in all kinds of different ways in sort of gradually negotiating the end of the Cold War in Geneva and Reykjavik. I hope I've got those dates right, but I think that's 85 and 86. His signal contribution, and I think in certain ways life adventure, was helping to end the Cold War. And so that was one of the things that we talked a lot about. And I think I at least puzzled a lot over. What was the meaning of that? How do you move forward from that? What is it as an accomplishment? And what is it something to build on? And I would say that we both felt a lot of unease in these conversations, or at least I did. And I know, I think he did too. I feel like I certainly was just kind of groping in the dark with this kind of sense that things weren't going totally well in terms of Russia in particular. Some of the puzzles that we talked about was why was Putin increasingly taking authoritarian control in the country? There were just all these tiny little signs of this. Crackdowns and elimination of civil society organizations, foreign contacts, things like that, things that were just making it increasingly difficult for any kind of democracy to flourish in Russia. And yet they were such tiny steps. I think this is a classic sort of quality of rising autocracy, such tiny steps that you just feel uneasy and you can't really explain them to other people. I have so much this experience at the university, just how difficult it is to see this process and recognize the implications of things like putting certain people in jails and that nothing happens as a result of that, or taking Crimea, things like that. So what is going on here? Also, Putin's KGB origins. Why in the West was there this sense that the Russian bear was a good pal at this point? Why was Europe developing such a degree of energy dependence on Russia? In the year of 2013 and 2014, I left Nevada. I went to the Institute for Advanced Study, where I continued to think a lot about these problems. That's actually what that picture is there. That's the main building. I don't think we met very much after that. So that was kind of like the culmination for me of just like this massive puzzlement over what was going on. So what can we do now? How do we live up to Ty's civic commitment to national and global security? So deeply humane, so utterly committed to the people in the broadest sense, and such a model for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was really fabulous tribute. I want to follow up just a little bit because I too talked to Ty quite a bit about my time in Russia in the late 90s and the early 2000s when we were attempting to negotiate, and I was leading a delegation on proliferation-resistant nuclear technologies, gearing up to the Putin-Clinton summit that was held in 2000, which turned out to be a disaster. I was back and forth to Moscow, and this actually was from one of the markets in Moscow. Ty and I talked a lot about the fact that there was such a difference between being downtown Moscow, which that time the oligarchs were coming in, and then going out to the ring road. And I also went out to other communities. You couldn't drink the water in Moscow. My counterpart, who I negotiated with, his family had no electricity. We went out to the villages that were just on the ring road outside of Moscow, and it was like stepping back 300 years in time. I commended the folks that I knew and I work with and I hung around with in the embassy for their desire to champion, women's rights and democracy and all these things. But really, in the communities around, nobody could put food on the table. People were selling everything they owned in little carts on the sides of the roads. And Ty and I talked about that with the notion that at some point this was going to come back to haunt us. It did. It came back with a vengeance. And I also was talking to him about how we were dealing with Putin in the early days in 2000. And we just could see the writing on the wall. And, I was working very strictly in the energy space. And so we talked a lot about the need for working on diversified energy. And I come back to those conversations, as Barbara did, with how prescient he was, how he understood the people and what was going on, not just the politics. To me, that was the gift that he brought to all of you, to the National Security Forum. And it's the legacy that we are very honored to carry on. We have some familiar faces. What I asked is some people who were the old guard from NSF to give us some thoughts, and you will recognize many of them. Keith Hansen. Keith is on Zoom. John Woodworth, you've heard from. John is zooming in from Virginia. Ted Morris is here. I've asked all of them to reflect on Ty's contribution to NSF and to national security in general. I'm going to start out with a tribute that Ray Huffstetler. So many of you remember Ray Huffstetler, right? Ray, unfortunately, was not able to join us today, but he wrote this beautiful tribute, which I'm honored to be able to read to you today. Ty Cobb, one can say without exaggeration, was a man of many parts. His roots in Reno led him to a career in military where he became one of those rare soldier scholars who exerted subtle influence on the course of our foreign policies and military perceptions during the Cold War. He was a deeply thoughtful and probing man who could assess foreign rivals without demonizing them, a prerequisite to recognizing repressed internal opposition and secret leadership skills. And from his academic background at the U.S. Military Academy, teaching Soviet affairs, he emerged onto the Washington policy scene at a critical era of the Cold War. By the end of the Carter administration, relations between the US and Soviet Union were severely strained. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, causing President Carter to withdraw the proposed SALT III treaty from ratification in the Senate and to boycott the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. President Reagan was elected in November 1980 and faced truly unsettled times. Prior to his inauguration, I had occasion to brief the president-elect and some of his cabinet nominees on the Soviet strategic threat. The news was not good, and the president-elect would have to deal with a number of complex challenges. Once in office, he didn't have long to wait. Early on, the Soviets declared martial law in Poland, and the president imposed economic sanctions on them and labeled them the evil empire. Less than 2 years later, a Soviet interceptor shot down Korean Airlines 0007 in the South Sea of Japan. The US deployed intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe, and the Soviets walked out of the struggling arms control talks in Geneva. This was the international environment in 1983 when Ty Cobb arrived at the National Security Council to take on his new responsibilities to advise President Reagan on Soviet relations. Fortunately, international relations have their ups and downs. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new General Secretary of the Communist Party in the USSR, and the dialogue between the president and the General Secretary began to thaw. This led to a series of summits, such as Reykjavik in 1986, where they discussed abolishing all nuclear weapons, and where, parenthetically, Ty Cobb was the primary NSC staff planner. In 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And in 1988, President Reagan stood in Red Square in Moscow and declared that the evil empire belonged to another era. Ty Cobb was a part of all of this, serving under President Reagan on the National Security Council and as special assistant to the president from 1983 until the end of the president's term in 1989. On leaving government and returning home to Reno, Ty served in various capacities as lecturer, advisor, and commentator. But he had an entrepreneurial side to him and was not content simply to talk. In 1991, Ty became president of Business Executives for National Security. Later in 2009, he established the National Security Forum in Reno to afford local members an opportunity to discuss current issues and to hear from experts in the national security field. I respect Ty Cobb for his astute analytical capabilities and his many contributions to national security. I am grateful to Ty Cobb for his contributions to this community, most particularly for his pioneering work in fostering enlightened discussions of complex but significant national security topics, such as those that we address in the National Security Forum. Ty made that happen. And thank you, Ray, for your words, and thank you, Ty, for your service. We've got a few other comments.
Ladies and gentlemen, Llewellyn and Ty's family, thank you so much. I have to tell you that I'm pretty certain Ty and I were born brothers. The fact that we had different mothers did not dissuade us. We just seemed to hit it off, and I thank heavens for that. When we finally met here, we had seen each other somewhere before, and we both said the same thing. I know you from somewhere. Yeah, I know you from somewhere too. And for about the first year, year and a half of our friendship, it was, Joe, I know what it was. Were you at Fort Belvoir when they had that big blackout thing and there was storms everywhere and all the codes wouldn't work? No? I mean, I was at Belvoir a dozen times, but not during that time. Oh, okay. And then I'd see him a month later and I'd say, oh, Ty, I got it. I got it. I was the young kid on the block at DIA at the NATO desk. And you came over to get a backgrounder on something that in Eastern Europe. He said, that wasn't me. Oh, okay. So we finally gave up on playing that game, but instead we had the most marvelous relationship as if we had met before. And there was no means of not just being ourselves with each other. We both felt very, very strongly about national security of the United States and the allied democracies with whom we work so closely. And that vision was so strong that we ended up sending back and forth to each other, even when we weren't having lunch or didn't see each other. We would send back, here's a great article from Foreign Affairs, here's a great one from such and such, and let's talk about this stuff. And we did. In between all of the terrible jokes he sent me and the very, very few jokes I sent back, but mostly it was that shared sense that there is an importance that the entire populace of the United States and our allies must understand about security. But it didn't stop there, because we were both also deeply interested in what made a certain country believe the way it did based upon its history. There's cultural ideas that are shared for 300, 200, 100 more recent years. And if you don't understand that part of it, you're never going to be able to negotiate with your enemies or talk with your friends. And that extended to languages as well, which he regularly tried to one-up me on. I got back from a short trip to the Balkans where I was on a lecture tour. I came back, I had, 6 words of Serbo-Croatian, and I mistakenly said, Dobro jutro. And he said, God knows what. Some stream of Serbo-Croatian. And I said, now, where did you pick that one up? Oh, my people are from there. Oh, I didn't know that. And the same in Italian, and this, which we shared a little bit of, he a lot of, and so on. So the fact that you need to understand the whole matrix, not just say, well, this is their politics and this is ours, and now we're going to be able to negotiate intelligently. Not going to happen. So we also had a love of reading. I mentioned we sent emails back and forth, articles. We also exchanged books, and with no expectation, or we should have had no expectation of ever seeing them again. I have no doubt that some of my books are currently, Sue Ellen, on the shelves at your house. And I know for sure I have at least one on mine. And it just worked. It just worked. When I came to Reno, after I retired from the service, and I came to Reno, and Ty was so welcoming, so gracious in inviting me to join the National Security Forum. I was a presenter for the forum. I was a member of the forum. I served on panels with many of the folks that are here or not here at the NSF forums. And it was just wonderful how welcoming he was and insistent that I stir the pot a little bit, as he said. Don't be shy. Say something really controversial. Oh, darn. Not tough to do. So he also tried to get me to go to be his backstop for a local television station, because every time the balloon went up somewhere around the world, every time there was a conflict somewhere, Ty dutifully, for his community, put on a coat and a tie. Well, maybe not a tie, a coat and a sweater, or a coat and a tie. And he went down to the station and they would interview him about what's really going on now. We have a local expert. Regrettably, by that time, I was out of the country 2-3 months out of the year. And so I really couldn't be the backstop. But we did get a chance to do an interview together. Ty got a big cane and sucked me in and collared me and said, listen, I'm going to do something for a local station and they want point counterpoint. And I said, do I have to disagree with you on purpose just to disagree? He said, well, you do that all the time. So I said, well, what is it about? And he said, it's on a program called Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And I said, well, I like two of those things. Jim Clark, I'm not saying which two. Actually, I thought it was a great name for a television show. So we went on, we got mic'd up, and I said, by the way, Ty, what's the topic? He said, hell, I don't know. Just go along with it. And the guy said, well, as long as we're talking about China today. I said, oh, well, there's a good clue at least. So we started out with a couple of questions about China from the interviewer, and then we immediately moved to Russia, and then we moved back to China, and then we moved to the situations in the rest of the world, round and round and round. And the guy never asked another question. And when the commercial came on, mic's off, he said, well, what the hell am I doing here? And I thought he was mad at us until I got that kind of impish smile that he gets on his face. And the other guy smiled, and I said, oh, he liked it, I guess. Well, that was the case. And we went back again for the last 12 minutes, and it didn't stop. We just went and went and went and had such a grand time. And it was one of my most wonderful memories of that time with Ty. I loved that impish, my choice of terms, smile of his. I miss that smile. I miss that man. We could all do a lot worse than devote our lives to service to country, service to the community we live in, service to family, and service to our friends. Here's to you, Ty. God bless you.
That was lovely. Thank you very much. I'm going to switch gears, Joe. We've got a lot of national security stuff. So I understand you have a few words prior to the unsecure tie part of the presentation. Come join us and introduce yourself.
I'm Joe Eberly, and for those of you who don't know me, I was a dentist here in town for about 45 years, so I don't know if I treated anybody. I couldn't help listening to Barbara talk about the Cold War. I was in the service in the 50s, and I was right in the middle of that. I was a nuclear weapons specialist, and we were constantly on call during those debates and conflicts that were going on. And the security was just unbelievably tight. So I witnessed that firsthand. But the thing I came here to talk about is my best friend, Ty Cobb. 67 years ago, when I got out of the service, I looking for a place to live, and I found Reno. And one of the first people I met was Ty Cobb. Ty and I were in the same fraternity, and we were different positions in that fraternity. He ultimately became the president. It's mentioned in his obit. And I was the house manager. Now, there's a conflict set up there. Ty loved to be the social leader, and I had to be responsible for the physical plant, the budget, and feeding 50 guys. So I had a limited amount of money. And Ty would say, Joe, let's figure out a way we can have a social event. I said, Ty, we don't have the money. He says, well, couldn't we eat beans and hot dogs for a while and have a little extra money? And so we'd go back and forth on this. And the other thing I remember growing up or living with him in the same room, he was an ROTC. And Ty was amazing. He could go to bed and had a paper due in the morning. And I said, Ty, aren't you going to do your paper? So I'll do it in the morning. And he did. And he got an A on it. It was just his natural talent. And And I criticizing about the way he dressed when he went for the ROTC. I said, Ty, if I dressed like that when I was in service, they'd court-martial me. And he says, well, I've got to do the best I can. I don't have an iron. So what he did was he'd take his pants at night and he'd squeeze it between the mattresses and he'd go to bed. And that was his idea of pressing his pants. And he'd get up, look a little better, but not from what I've experienced in the military. So, and the other thing I remember doing with Ty, he used to go down to the Gazette Journal. His father was managing editor. And he, on Friday nights, I'd get a six-pack of beer, and I'd go down there with him, and he had the phone in his ear and the hands on the typewriter, and he would do all of the sports. And there was a deadline, I think, at 11 o'clock. So we'd have to get there about 9:30. And he'd write these sports stories for the paper. And I'd sit there and talk with him and drink a few beers. And we did this many, many times. And the other thing he noticed in the obit, they mentioned something about the VTA. Remember that? You guys that were there? The touring association we had? And the total asset of the touring association was a 1943 school bus, which we tore out the back seats and put in some mattresses. And we'd go on Friday nights. The big deal was going down through downtown Reno, cruising up and down. But the one thing we did, we'd go down Sorority Row, and the mothers told the girls, don't get in that bus. Well, that was like saying, get in the bus, because we'd stop and they couldn't get in fast enough. And so we'd cruise around town. And that was our social event on Friday nights. And I was on a track team, and oftentimes the bus would stall, and we'd have to get out and push it to start it. And it wore me out because I had a track meet the next day. But the thing that I remember the most, he always was full of good ideas. And he'd get people to implement those ideas. And one of the things he said, you know, Eberly, we got to take off for 3 months. I know he got a job with Rocketdyne and their space program. I was an engineer. Ty studied European civilization. And then John Matson was a businessman. He was the guy that was going to be involved in this. And he said, we got to go to Europe. And I says, Cobb, I got to go to work. He says, oh, just tell him you want a 3-month delay. So I did. I wrote them, and they said, okay, fine. We'll see you in September. And Ty didn't have to go into service until a little later. So we went to Europe for 3 months, and I had $1,000. And some of the highlights in that trip were memorable. One of the things I'll never forget, he kept talking about Pamplona and running the bulls. And so we land in London, we go to France. He said, the second week in July. He said, according to Ernest Hemingway's book. I said, okay. So we get there the second week in July, and we hit Pamplona, and there's nobody there. It's completely dead. And I said, Ty, you blew this one. And he says, no, I know it's right. It's got to be this time. So we went outside of the town, and like we did on the trip, we had a little car. We paid $1,200 for it. And our idea of sleeping, we had sleeping bags, and we threw it under this tree out on somebody's field there. And we're having a little snooze. And this guy comes by who's working out there in the land in a two-wheel cart. And he comes over to us and he speaks Spanish. Well, Ty could understand Italian, so he could communicate. And so Ty starts laughing. And I said, what's so funny? He says, well, this is about noon or 1 o'clock. He says, well, this guy just told me they're all sleeping. And I said, what do you mean they're sleeping? He says, yeah, they'll be up around 3 o'clock. We go back to town. Sure enough, they're all out, ready to party. We didn't know why, but we found out fast. What happens is at 6 o'clock or so in the evening, there's a square in the town of Pamplona, and there's 7 drum and bugle corps, about 5 in each one, and each one represents a bull that's going to be in the event that night. So what you do is you get behind the drum bugle corps that you feel is going to have the most brave bull. We didn't know. We just got behind them and started drinking wine, running around the square. So about 8 o'clock at night or 9, we all head to the stadium. And you sit in your own little section. And you cheer on when your bull comes in. Okay? And if he dies bravely, everybody's yelling and screaming, thinking this is the greatest thing. But if it doesn't, they play the funeral march. All right? So this goes on till about 11, 12 o'clock at night. And then you come back out, go around the square, and you do this till 6 o'clock in the morning. Now comes the running of the bulls. They bring the bulls in from one end of town, and they run them to the stadium. And at that time, this is 1962. Cobb says, you want to run with the bulls? I said, yeah, I'll run with the bulls. Because I had no problem. I ran. I was the miler at the school, so I could run. So we go to the end of town, and there are no guard gates up, nothing. You just get in the street and run. And we run them into the stadium for that night. So this went on 7 nights. They killed 7 bulls every night. And you could go in there and play with the bulls if you want. You know, the younger ones. They didn't have the ones you're going to kill that night. So that was Pamplona. So then the next stop was Switzerland. And the reason that was so important, my mother and dad are immigrants from Switzerland. And I told Ty, I said, Ty, we're going to live like kings when we get to Switzerland. Because we're just living on a budget. We ate bread and cheese most of the time. We got to Switzerland, and I had no address, nothing. I didn't know where, I just knew the town, a little town where my dad was born. And we get this little town, and there's signs up, Eberly Bakeria, Eberly Sports Foods. I said, God, it's like Smith. There's all these Eberlys around. So let's go to the bakery. They got food there. So we went into the bakery, and I, for some reason, remember the Swiss my parents taught me when I was 5 years old. And I started speaking to this person and told her who I was. And all she yelled, stay, Warta, Warta. And she runs out. 10 minutes later, got all these people coming. And there's aunts and uncles and cousins. And we had the greatest time in the world there for a week. We went to one of my cousin's weddings, and we ate like kings, and they washed our clothes, and it was just a wonderful time. And the next thing I remember is when we went to Yugoslavia. Ty said, I got a friend who lives here. I said, okay, got any address? I think he's in this town or something. Anyway, we found him. And his friend was so proud of the Americans. And he says, I got to take you guys to this festival. Says, okay. So we go to this festival up in the mountains, and we're in this little, kind of like a bar, drinking. And the friend, Ty's friend, was so proud of us. He kept telling us, these are my American friends, and he just going on. Well, it was under, that's when Tito was in control. It was under communist rule. They weren't too happy about that. And so Ty gets into an argument. No, his friend gets in an argument, so Ty's going to defend him, right? And I said to John, John, get the car. And I said, get it out there and blow the horn when you're there. and I'll grab Ty and we'll get the heck out of here, you know. And so we got into the horn, and these guys were running after us. So we jumped in our car and we took off. And we hit a bump and tore the engine mounts loose on the car. And we made it back to this guy's place and got the car fixed. And the next stop was East Berlin. Now, that was something to remember. We went in from East Germany and down into the corridor, and we went into East Berlin. And Ty says, "We got to go on the east side." I said, "Okay." He was always the leader. He had all the suggestions. So we just followed him around. And so we went into Charlie Checkpoint. And we were between Charlie Checkpoint and the eastern side. It's about a 50-yard no man's land there. They had machine gun nests there, dogs running in between. And just as we were between Charlie Checkpoint and the east side, we heard this machine gun fire. And we hit the ground because it was so close. And we had to keep going in. They gave us 3 hours. We had to be out. So we went in. We came out 3 hours later. And as we got out and walked around the West German side, 100 yards down from us, all these people were singing. And they had all these flowers against the wall. And so we finally asked some people, what happened? Well, while that machine gun fire was going on, they shot two kids that were trying to get out. And you can look at this in Time Magazine, the second week in August, 1962. The story's in there. And they let this one guy sit there and lay there and die for an hour. And I'll never forget that. Little did Ty know, in 1962, 25 years later, he would be there with Reagan, helping him with that speech. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. 25 years later. So it was an amazing experience, but I'll never forget Ty. I mean, he and I were inseparable for 5 years. He made me do things I didn't know was possible. And he'd lead me along the way and I'd follow. So just one person I'll never forget.
Wow. I'm going to open it up to our folks on Zoom. Okay, how about I move to Keith?
Thank you. And I want to thank Joe and Ray and Everly for their comments. Unfortunately, I only got to know Ty later in his life, so I missed some of these wild experiences of a young guy. But a couple comments. One is Ty and I shared the conviction that there is no retirement. You stop full-time employment, but you do not retire. You do other things. And I admired Ty for that as he ran the bins activity. And I've tried to honor that in my life as well. Just stay active as long as you can breathe and contribute. So that's a legacy that he leaves. When I was involved in the INF negotiations, along with John Woodworth, who's also hopefully will speak today, Ty was there because we were working so much with NATO to maintain solidarity on the U.S. side of that negotiation against the Soviets to get rid of those missiles. And so Ty was involved in that. I was in Geneva when he came with Reagan for the Gorbachev summit. I didn't make it to Reykjavik. We in Geneva were sitting there saying, why weren't any of us invited to go along to Reykjavik? We're negotiating this treaty of getting rid of nuclear weapons, but that's the way the government works. When I finally got to the Tahoe area after I left the Washington area and left Stanford, coming and discovering what was the precursor of the NSF through Ray Huffstetter, who said, "Hey, Ty Cobb runs a small group of guys, and we get together once a week or once a month and chat. Why don't you come in and do that?" And so I got a hold of Ty and said, "Hey, can I come and join you?" Ty and I had met earlier because I had been a speaker for Ben's. From Washington, I'd gone to California, I'd gone to Kansas and other places to speak at various Ben's groups. So we were acquainted, but not really close by any means. And so he immediately asked me to address this small group of people, which I did and have been doing for the last 18 years, which has been, I have to say, one of the things moving to the Tahoe area that has made life very, very rewarding is being connected with Ty and the National Security Forum. It has really just kept my brain active, and it's just wonderful. Now, working with Ben, with Ty, the NSF has been a bit of a challenge. Being an Army guy and I'm the Navy guy, we didn't always see eye to eye on things, but it gave us opportunities to banter a lot in front of the room, in front of the group, which grew from about a dozen to over a couple hundred at some of our NSF forums in the past. So he did a great job of making this a very rewarding and exciting opportunity for people in our general community to participate and stay plugged in. Personally, he was a very generous and humble guy. And I just wish I had taken the time to spend more time with him, as some of you were able to do. It's one of the regrets that we don't take advantage of the gym that's in front of us. And then until it's gone, do we realize what we miss. With his incredible legacy to our community, his incredible legacy to our country, and to the world to a big extent through his work on international relations. He leaves a great legacy, and I'm going to miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate that. John, I'm going to put you up next, and Ted, I'm going to give you the last word. I wanted to read something from another part of Ty's life. So this was a comment that came in from one of our folks on Zoom. Ty hired me at what was then the Yosemite National Institute in 1998. He mentored me for several years, befriending my wife and our new son, and was a bright light of knowledge and humanity. I credit Ty for much of my later professional path and success. He was the most important mentor I've ever had. I have tickets to attend the celebration of life in Reno to pay my respects. Thank you for remembering him in this way, the stories I could tell. And that's from Brian Windrop. There were many, many stages in Ty's life. We tend to celebrate the national security ones, but I wanted him to be remembered also for the contributions he made in other organizations, always with the same guiding light of mentoring and being open to everyone. So, John, do you have a few words?
Well, yes, Maureen. First, let me thank you for asking me to participate in this. I can't begin to match some of the personal contacts and experiences that our speakers that I've been listening to have had with Ty Cobb. My connections to Ty are, I would say, much narrower, if you will. We both came to government service from different directions, but we met and connected during the 1980s. I had been earlier worked at the U.S. mission to NATO in the 1970s, and then I was the head of theater nuclear policy in the Pentagon, and then eventually found my way into the INF negotiations that occupied much of my career during that time. Ty, of course, when he came to the NSC, put us both in a situation of interacting with each other in the interagency work that went into this incredible period of time. Some call it the missile years in Europe. I know from my own experience, I know that Ty knew it from his and from the contacts we had, but this was an extremely important, difficult, challenging time, both with our allies, but of course, with the Soviet Union. And Ty, of course, was the consummate expert on the Soviet Union. I couldn't even match his expertise, even though I spent 5 years, 6 years negotiating with them practically on a daily basis when we were in Geneva. But I always came to admire what my connections with Ty, what he accomplished when I completed the work on the INF Treaty. And of course, as Keith mentioned, he was there too, and he and I worked together on the negotiations during those periods of time. Now, I ended up as ambassador and deputy negotiator of the treaty. And when we finished it in 1987, I know that this, in Ty's eyes, was a remarkable accomplishment because of his close linkage with President Reagan. So this is all something we could be proud of. And I think I know he was, and I was too, struck by the impact of the treaty in Europe and beyond. It changed the security politics in Europe almost completely and almost overnight, and left a legacy that unfortunately did not carry forward indefinitely, but it had a huge impact at its time. And of course, it carried into the presidency of George H.W. Bush, who drew on what was done by both Ty and others in changing the relationship with the Soviet Union. So I'll only mention one other second part of my connection to Ty, but this indirect, I can't claim any personal connection to it. And that is his work on the NSF. During the time when he was instrumental in establishing the NSF, I was the chairman of the board and a leader in the very similar organization in Charlottesville, Virginia, called the Charlottesville Committee on Foreign Relations. Its lineage went back even to the 1950s in our connection to the Council on Foreign Relations, and then subsequently our connection through the larger national organization, the American Committees on Foreign Relations. And then finally, we went independent. But during the time I was doing all of this, I thought back on it, and this was the time when Ty was setting up the NSF. And I just wish we could have traded ideas at the time when he was doing the work he was doing. And I'll only read one sentence from the defining purpose of the Charlottesville Committee on Foreign Relations: a civic, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the promotion of informed discussion of American foreign policy and international affairs. Well, I'm sure that this has a lot of echoes for all of you who have been so successful and constructive in taking Ty's legacy and the National Security Forum that you're so connected to. And I just want to wish you good success. And I know Ty's contribution is instrumental and will never be forgotten.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that.
Maureen, may I make one comment that ties in with what John did with Ty during the INF negotiation? Very short. Ty shared with me one time, he said, when Colin Powell was security advisor and I was on the staff, we were working with the interagency group to try to come up with the INF policy for the negotiation, which was very, very tense and very acrimonious in Washington. And he said, I walked into Colin Powell's office one day and said, boss, I can't get the interagency to come to an agreement. I need help. He said, you know what Colin Powell told me? I said, what? He said, Colonel, I hired you to solve these problems, not come to me with your whining. Get to work.
That's a good message to all of us. Thank you. Ted?
I would refer to what you talked about, the early establishment of the NSF and that interview that was given by Ty. A lot of what I was going to say was on the mechanical side of that, but also in terms of what Ty's own vision and commitment was. And I'll just wind up as the last of all this. We have to be so grateful for his vision of what international security is to American and his commitment to bring that down to the level of each and every one of us, establishing the National Security Forum so that people could talk amongst themselves. And the beginning of 8 and 10, 12 people around to even now, the way the NSF is set up, even though we have international speakers or national, we still have the original commitment that Ty made for 45 minutes before each of those meetings where we can sit around and talk person to person here at the Reno Tahoe area of what national security means to us. I could go into lots of personal experiences, but I would wind up to say, almost the way Joe had it earlier, Ty and I considered ourselves kindred spirits. We complemented each other. He saw things from the Washington area. My 37 years of foreign service, 30 of it was from the field, and we respected what he brought from the wider perspective, but he very much appreciated what I saw and worked on from a field perspective as we talked about many of the conflicts that I had been involved with. And President Reagan gave me the highest awards twice because of the involvement of the peace process and the reconstruction process. And I'll say, in the end, even his home countries, going back to the Serbo-Croatia area. And he and I were going to meet after this last trip I took earlier, a couple of months ago, into Croatia to talk about that war and what I was doing to reconstruction of it then and now. And unfortunately, we didn't get that last time. He and I did meet outside of the National Security Forum frequently for a lunch down at his favorite restaurant. And I value all of the wonderful times that we had, but especially his commitment that our values as Americans start with the value of an involved citizenry, as John just mentioned also. And so grateful that he established the NSF that gave us the legacy to continue for that involvement. Goodbye to all.
Thank you, Ted. That was fabulous. What a great way to end. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Sue Ellen and Rick, for being here with us today. And we wish you all well. Keep Ty in your thoughts and prayers and continue, please, his legacy of talking about these issues to your friends and family. Take care.